Hey, this is Dr. Show, the Japanese behaviorist. Previously, we looked into a historic meeting between Noam Chomsky and Charles Catania on EnGrama Channel. It was an epic meeting because it was the first meeting since Chomsky and Skinner had disagreement some 65 years ago. The discussion was intense and very difficult, but also rewarding. It was surely a graduate level psychology. So if you haven't watched that video yet, challenge yourself by watching my tutorial. For me personally, it was also pretty challenging to make the tutorial too, but it brought me some rewards. One reward was that it gave me an opportunity to connect with wonderful behavior analysts in Japan, like Dr. Tanaka. I got to present at one of her seminars, and you can check out our collaboration here, though it was in Japanese. The other reward was that Professor Charles Catania himself reached out to me. Somehow my video went around the universe and landed on his computer. Yeah, the internet can do some magic sometimes, huh? He offered to chat online and we had a nice conversation. He told me about the behind the scenes story of his meeting with Chomsky too. So that was epic. And he sent me this book. It's an undergraduate level textbook of behavior analysis that Professor Catania wrote, and he offered me to translate it into Japanese. So many thanks to Charlie. Yeah, I can call him Charlie now. Okay, let's get into the main topic of this video. The meeting between Chomsky and Catania continued on EnGrama Channel for 3 more videos. And when I was talking to Charlie, he was like, when will you do the tutorial for the rest of the videos? So here is the second tutorial I'm delivering for him. So hope he likes it. The second meeting between Chomsky and Catania was basically about 3 different topics. First, they talked about whether science is able to predict human behavior at all. Second, they talked about science and politics. And the third was about the philosophy of language. They're all pretty advanced topics in psychology, so you can kind of feel what it's like to be a psychology graduate student with this video. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Okay, I guess what I find fascinating about this list is the places where I see we have areas of agreement. I mean, well, when I see something like the appeal to innate things, I see that as not an issue and not a problem. That, of course, what we humans do depends upon our anatomy and all sorts of things. Certainly, the whole articulatory apparatus that allows us to speak is a function of genetic histories and so on. And in fact, I would like to come back, though, to the question of whether some of the things that appear in a historical perspective to be in opposition really are differences in whether we're looking at, first of all, whether we're looking at function or looking at structure. But another part of it is that the behavioral approach tends to look first to the environment and then work its way in. Whereas Noam, you was speaking, for example, of the recursive core that is the fundamentals of language as being something that's the source of what we're able to do, and I think even if all of that was there, that's fine, except that it doesn't say much about what people are going to talk about and when they're going to speak and the things they speak about. And I see then the possibility of an account of those functional things, the things that the environment determines. And I don't see necessarily an incompatibility between those functional things and the things that we can say about what the constraints might be on the structure of a language and so forth. So I wonder if you might want to pick up from there and we can we can see where it goes.
The first topic is about social sciences. As we went through in the previous tutorial, Catania is a behaviorist who sees language as behavior. He is interested in scientifically investigating how each of us learns to speak through socialization. For behaviorists, language is like playing sports. Take a look at football, for example. You learn to play football from your friends and coaches. It is true that you need cognitive ability to understand football, but that's just a part of the whole activity. There are a lot of social learning aspects too. There are the rules to remember, skills to acquire, watching games in media, joining a high school team, and so on. It's a complicated interactive process. What Catania is saying here is that language as behavior is necessarily shaped by the similar social environment, just like any other sports. As we learn to throw a ball, we learn to pronounce some sounds. As we learn the rules of the football, we learn the grammatical rules. As we learn to play with other people, we learn to speak and listen. Essentially, behaviorists are interested in this type of organism-environmental interaction as a study of verbal behavior.
Well, we certainly have to make a distinction between the nature of language or any other cognitive system and the way it's used. That distinction goes back to classical Greece. It's a distinction between what Aristotle called possession of knowledge and use of knowledge. So if we're talking about, there is a research project which seeks to discover the nature of language, the way it evolved, its structure, its components, how it's acquired, and so on. That's all about the nature of language. Well, there's another endeavor which asks, how do people use this? What do they decide what to say? About that, there's almost nothing to say. There's no account whatsoever that deals with what you and I are doing right now. Basically none, or any other casual conversation. Too many things are involved. These are way too many variables are involved for anything coherent to be said. And in fact, we know nothing about it. There's nothing to be said about conversations. You can do statistical analysis and show that after this word, some other word is more likely to appear than another one is. That's in fact the basis of the deep learning work. But that is so superficial and trivial that it's hardly worth talking about.
Chomsky, on the other hand, is interested in the structure of language. He believes that humans have a specific mechanism in human brains that generate language. If you have this language acquisition machine, the social environment is not that important. With a small amount of stimulation, the brain automatically turns on the machine and generates language without much help from the outside. Because of that, Chomsky isn't interested in social influences on language. In fact, in response to Catania, Chomsky says, you cannot study how people use language because too many variables are involved. Look how decisive Chomsky is. He says it's impossible, and that's it. The king of social science gave a verdict.
There are three factors that you can't get away from in determining what my dog will do next or what I will say next. One factor is the internal structure of the organism. What kind of a structure does it have? That's one factor. In the case of learning, that begins with innate structure. Second factor is whatever the environmental circumstances are. Third factor is just laws of nature. How do things function in general? And then you can look at the mixture of these factors. No, in the case of the first of these studies, the study of the nature, evolution, acquisition of language, I think there's a fair number of results. In the second area, how language is put to use, there's some generalizations, but there's basically nothing in the way of science.
I'd argue that there's more than
it's too complicated.
Yeah, of course it's complicated. In fact, one of the things that's essential for us to recognize in talking about language in particular is multiple causation, is that any particular bit of behavior, anything we do is simultaneously impacted by a whole variety of things. Multiple things in the environment, as well as multiple things having to do with physiology and history and genetics and so forth. Even somebody walking into a fast food restaurant, where these days they don't do it as much because of COVID, but will be influenced by what other people are saying and the signs that are up and the smells that are there and the time of day it is. And each of these things separately will determine maybe what this person is going to say and order in a particular instance. But, you know, we can't identify the details of particular physical things that happen all the time. So, for example, if we were watching a leaf that had just fell off a tree and it drifted across the street and fell down at somebody's feet, and somebody who is a specialist in aeronautical engineering were to be asked about why the leaf turned at a particular point in its descent, he or she could make guesses about which way the wind was blowing and the surface of the leaf and all. And even if that person's account of that falling leaf was unsatisfactory, we wouldn't necessarily say, well, gee, you're lousy in your discipline because you can't say anything, but there might still be underlying principles. The things I can have seen that are manipulable things in the laboratory, and they are just little pieces. I think they're the beginnings. I agree with you that we don't know a lot, that we got plenty that we've yet got to study and to understand. But I do know that I can change the content of a conversation by differentially responding to what the other person says. And I think that's terribly important to know about, because I think that happens in politics all the time. I think that's part of the evils that go on in contemporary things. And so one speaker can determine what another speaker says. And in fact, if I've sat at social events where you see conversations going around the table, and you can see how somebody starts to speak, and suddenly some people turn their heads and are now interacting, and that person then increases the talk about certain kinds of things. So there are things in the dynamics that are studied not just by behavioral folks like me, but sociologists are studying networks of communication. And I think there are some regularities there that we're beginning to discover things about. So I'm a little bit more hopeful that
Catania tries to appeal. He gives an analogy of a leaf falling off a tree. Physics can tell you why a leaf falls off a tree. It's gravity. But the way it falls involves more than gravity. A leaf is so light that it gets affected by the movement of air around it, such as wind, temperature, and other objects' movement. Now, the movement of air in atmosphere is a scientific field of aerodynamics, which is a part of physics. According to Catania, you can find out how a leaf will fall based on the calculation of those aerodynamic factors. Then you can figure out why a leaf falls off the tree and how it does. In the movie Forrest Gump, the opening scene involves a bird feather that flies in the air. They animated this feather frame by frame at the time. Nowadays, you can generate a computer simulation of it. Catania points out that the same can be done with human behavior and language.
No problem with that. We can say lots of things, just common sense about how behavior takes place, how it's influenced by circumstances, how I would react to what somebody says, and so on. And if any of that can be made more precise and some principles can be discovered, there's anything to learn about it, be delighted. Can't see why there can be any question about that. Personally, I'm skeptical because I think it's a too many variable problem. it is the leaf example that you used is actually a good one. No matter how much physicists and aeronautical engineers are going to learn, they're never going to be able to save any much of interest about leaves blowing in the wind. There's just too many things involved.
But Chomsky says, no, that's impossible. He says, you can get general idea of why and how leaf falls off the tree, but you can't predict how each and every leaf on Earth behaves in real life, because the calculation becomes astronomically gigantic. Newton even said that it is impossible to calculate the interaction of 3 planets, because the calculation is just way too much. This is called the 3-body problem. The behavior of a leaf and air molecules is much more than 3 bodies. Now, Chomsky then says it's impossible to predict what people would say or do. Human behavior, especially language, is influenced by too many environmental factors. You can't do science of such a complicated system. Chomsky sounds convincing, right? We can all agree that it's way too difficult to study human behavior. But then, you wonder, wait a minute, did Chomsky just reject all of social sciences? If you say that it's impossible to predict human activity of any kind because there are too many variables, then you cannot do social sciences. Psychology, sociology, and economics all study human activities. What's more, Chomsky kinda rejected all of linguistics too, which is his own discipline. I know Chomsky makes those bold remarks, but I think he went too far on this one. Catania here is trying really hard to find a middle ground. He makes a point that, yeah, maybe it is too complicated to predict every single word that we utter, but we can approximate what we say and do in general. It's just a matter of degree. Take a look at meteorology. Scientists made progress and are able to predict weather pretty well. Of course, it is far from perfect. You can't yet predict how every single raindrop falls, but we can get a big picture of local weather and it's useful. It would be even more accurate and convenient as these scientists make progress. The same is true for social sciences. Of course, it is impossible to predict what we say every moment yet, but we can predict a moral behavior pattern rather easily. That's what economists, psychologists, and linguists do. Economists predict group economic behavior as a function of economic policies, the availability of resources, and so on. Psychologists, including behaviorists, observe patients' daily routine and treat abnormal behavior patterns. And linguists can predict how our language has changed and will change over time. I think it's pretty impressive, don't you agree? It is not a matter of possible or impossible, like Chomsky says. It is a matter of degree. Okay, Catania probably thought this topic was a dead end, so he changes the topic. The next topic is about science and politics. Let's see what they have to say.
Okay. Well, maybe then we ought to turn to a couple of other things, because there were quite a few things in that list, and then there were quite a few things we never got around to talking about. I'd be particularly interested in hearing a little bit more of other kinds of things that have involved you and Skinner, and that history. Of course, I know about the language review, but I also know about the review of Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which I think fewer people recognize or know about these days. And given that I did work there in Cambridge, and although I was familiar with Skinner's work, I was surprised at how critical of his views that review was, given that I suspect that you and he would probably have agreed on certain political things about totalitarian control versus other kinds of control. And
Now, they move on to the second topic, the relationship between science and politics. Specifically, Catania asks Chomsky about his review of Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Beyond Freedom and Dignity is a book B.F. Skinner wrote in 1971. What Skinner discussed in this book was his idea of how to make our society better using the science of behavior. He says that the key to improving our society is to recognize that we have no free will. That's pretty provocative, isn't it? Skinner says that the environmental factors control human behavior, whether it is choice, language, thinking, or any daily behavior. Once we recognize that, we can arrange our living environment such that we can live in peace and happiness. Skinner also says that to achieve this ideal, we must advance the science of behavior to the point we can figure it out what factor controls which of our behavior. But why is Skinner advocating that we don't have free will, besides making a scientific point? Daniel Dennett, a prominent American philosopher who recently passed away, acknowledged that we don't have free will in terms of scientific standpoint. But, he says, it is not a good idea to tell people we don't have free will, because believing that we have free will actually brings good to society. Dennett believed that the belief of free will is useful in making our society a good place. Skinner says it used to be useful. Our civilization advanced nicely with the idea of free will for a while, but now we have to get rid of it to make it even better for the future. For example, society uses punishment when someone does something wrong. Let's say that someone steals your bike, and the police catch the thief and the court punishes him with a fine. Why do we punish the thief? Well, because he chooses to do bad things, so he also chooses to be punished. Skinner says, in reality, people don't choose to do bad things. People are made to do bad things because of the environmental influences. The thief might have stolen your bike not because of his free will, but maybe because he is in need of money, he might have lost his job recently, he might be threatened to do so, or he needed to prove he is worthy of a gang member. Whatever the reason, it makes no sense to punish the thief with a fine if we want him to make a better choice. If people do bad things because of their environmental pressure, then we should not punish the individuals. Rather, we should modify this person's environment or our society in general so this person won't need to do a bad thing again. Skinner called this cultural engineering. Skinner said, if we know enough about how the environment influences human behavior, which is to do the science of behavior, we can engineer our society so that everyone can be happy. To do so, we need to get rid of the idea of free will. Now, does his idea sound good to you? Well, not everybody was happy to hear Skinner's proposal, especially about free will. Chomsky opposed Skinner fiercely at that time, and he still does, as you can see.
You're talking now about the review of Beyond Freedom and Dignity?
yes, yes.
Well, I thought that book was pure totalitarianism. It was about how to control and manipulate people by some master controller who somehow knew all the answers and was trying to organize and shape behavior in their interest. Of course, the science was zero. There was nothing said about any scientific results about manipulation and control, because there aren't any. But the idea that that's a utopia, that seemed to me the ultimate dystopia. But I think that's consistent with Skinner's views. We were actually quite friendly personally, but he was a deep reactionary. And his idea that we could control, manipulate, and shape behavior, and we should do it, is, to me, just anathema, straight out of Stalinism.
I think that I feel almost like I read a different book.
Chomsky says Skinner is actually proposing a totalitarian regime. A totalitarian regime is pretty much the same as a dictatorship. Chomsky thinks Skinner believes that people are stupid and a small group of elite, that could be a behavioral scientist, should preach people what to do. That's what Chomsky means by a master controller controls people. Catania is rather shocked to hear Chomsky's reaction. Catania says, "It sounds like we are reading a different book." So why is Chomsky saying Skinner is proposing a totalitarian regime? This is because Chomsky sees something Skinner didn't. In his book, Skinner simply says to remove all the aversive stimuli and aversive behavior. If we only have good behavior, our society becomes peaceful and thriving. Straightforward, right? Well, it's a bit too simple and unrealistic. In reality, science can't evaluate what is good and bad. So who does? A dictator, Chomsky says. Consider this. Let's say there are two soda companies. They sell identical products and they are competing for sales. Now we say, guys, stop fighting. Let's figure out who gets what based on science. But this attempt will fail pretty quickly because science can't tell which company is better or if they should split the market in 50-50. What about the consumers? Should we buy half and half, or should we just get rid of all the sugar water altogether from our society because it's bad for health? Science can't figure out this kind of value-based question. If science can't answer this question, who can? If a small group of elite makes the decision and force their citizens to follow their order, then Chomsky says that is a totalitarian regime. And that's what Chomsky is seeing in Skinner's proposal. If you are working as a psychologist, a therapist, a nurse, or a doctor, this problem is actually pretty common. I recommend you read a paper called Balancing the Right to Habilitation with the Right to Personal Liberties, the rights of people with developmental disabilities to eat too many donuts and take a nap. I put a link in the description below. In essence, this paper asks what you as a therapist should do if your client wants to eat too many donuts. Should you restrict your client's diet for health reasons? If so, you can't complain when other people also restrict your diet of drinking beer and drinking coffee, can't you? In the field of healthcare, we face this question of value judgment all the time. Science can't tell you what to do.
So let me try my reactions to it. First, there's a very substantial part of it in which he extols the literature of freedom and talks about the role that early documents had in producing freedoms and resisting controlling regimes. And the other part of it is, and I understand that you don't feel that many of the things we've learned about contingencies are well enough defined that we can do much in the way of control. But I've always felt that if we see that some things are going on in the world, then we best find out as much as we can about them. And he wanted people to take this view that advertisers are controlling our behavior, educators are controlling our behavior, politicians are controlling our behavior, and that we ought to understand how some of that works. Now, you might say that he hasn't come up with a good way of doing that yet, but it seems that I never had the feeling that there was going to be a controller or even a group of controllers, that the idea was a thoroughly educated population who knew more about how some things in behavior worked would have a better defense against these kinds of abuses.
Now, the word a totalitarian regime has another component to it, which is the use of aversive control like violence and punishment, as well as a restriction of freedom of movement and speech, among other things. Skinner, of course, is against all of those. In fact, Skinner actually doesn't have a master controller controlling people idea in Beyond Freedom and Dignity. In his book, he actually says that ordinary people should learn the science of behavior so that we can counter-control the master controller. Skinner's idea is that the controller is also controlled by his or her environment. Thus, we should deliberately control the controller using the science of behavior. Skinner is consistent with the idea that no one has free will, whether you are a dictator or a slave.
My view of the contemporary politics is I see these things where politicians are shaping with each other's say, and you can see contingencies that lead some of them to lie a lot. And the lying has nothing to do with the way the world is, but have to do with what things you get when you say certain things. And that means that the things that people say are shaped up by the consequences they have. And sure, we are just scraping the surface and beginning to do a few of these things, but shouldn't we urge people to learn more about these kinds of things and be aware of them?
Absolutely. I've myself written reams about this: manufacturing consent, control of behavior, the way advertising works, the way the political system works. I think we should definitely learn a great deal about that. And I've, as I say, devoted plenty of my own time and energy to it. I didn't actually find anything in Skinner that contributed to this. What I saw there was basically restating common sense ideas in the terminology of reinforcement theory, which adds nothing except this oversimplifying more complex ideas. And then this background idea that we should have master controllers, super intelligences, namely us, who will somehow manipulate and control people for the common good. That's a very standard idea. Goes back to the liberal intellectuals a century ago who developed the concept of manufacturing consent, Walter Lippmann, engineering of consent, Edward Bernays, one of the founders of the public relations industry. And they were very clear and explicit about it. What they said is, people are stupid and ignorant. I'm quoting. Population is stupid and ignorant. Quote Reinhold Niebuhr, one of them. They are so stupid that we have to control them by necessary illusions and emotionally potent oversimplifications. And back to Walter Lippmann, we have to protect ourselves, the responsible men, from the roar and trampling of the bewildered herd. Their job is to be spectators, not participants. We'll run things because we're so smart, and we will control them by various mechanisms. That's the liberal variant of fascism. Turns out to end up quite the same way. In fact, there's very interesting historical work on this. So if you look at the end of the First World War, when a lot of these things were being developed, if you compare countries like Italy, England, the United States, same kind of ideas were being developed in reaction to the radical democratic thrust that was developing among the population at the end of the war. And what was the result was, how can we control this? Well, in Italy, it was done by force. In the United States and England, it was done by technocracy, by the ideas of a technocratic elite, which will separate itself from the stupid and ignorant population and control them. But the end results were pretty similar. I frankly don't think Skinner contributes anything to this, but it's a very important topic.
I also recommend you read Skinner's other book, Walden Two. Walden Two is a science fiction or a utopian fiction about small plant community. Skinner wrote Walden Two in 1948, which was 20 years before he wrote Beyond Freedom and Dignity. His idea hasn't changed much between the two books. In Walden Two, Skinner explores the idea of building a small, intentional community based on the science of behavior. But this planned community has a small group of organizers. Although Skinner writes that this governing body has no control over the members of the community, you can see how Chomsky could get the idea of the master controller here. Personally, I was fascinated when I read Walden Two. I was a college student. I'm a big-time sci-fi fan, so it was exciting to see how Skinner uses psychology in sci-fi. And Skinner's goal of promoting behavioral science to improve our living conditions was also inspiring. But as I look at it now, I must say Skinner was naive in his thinking. His idea is too simplistic and idealistic. Chomsky is much more realistic, and that could be a product of time. Skinner lived in an optimistic time, whereas Chomsky lived in a pessimistic time. America went through a lot between those two generations. Skinner grew up in the early 20th century America, where people believed science would make their lives better and happier. Skinner was not the only one who dreamed of having a science-based utopian society at that time. People generally believed in science and progress. Have you been to Disneyland's Tomorrowland? Tomorrowland is exactly that optimism. And we can still see this kind of optimism today from people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who proposes a scientific utopia called Rationalia. He's pretty much saying the same thing as Skinner did. But this optimism shattered in the World War II. If you watch Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, you can feel this naive optimism about scientific progress turning into fear of nuclear weapons. Nazis' eugenic program turned into the Holocaust, and the Soviet Union became a totalitarian regime and became a threat to the United States in the Cold War. People felt the scientific dystopia of Huxley and Orwell pretty much came true. And Chomsky is from that generation. He criticized the US government on the Vietnam War, was arrested many times, and was blacklisted in Nixon's government. So no wonder Chomsky is skeptical of Skinner's optimism. You can feel Chomsky's hatred against any kind of a master controller, even though Skinner didn't really think of that. Having said, Chomsky's view on Skinner is also biased. As we reviewed in the previous video about verbal behavior, Chomsky's view on Skinner is full of prejudice. And more importantly, as Catania points out, the point of Skinner's book is that we should all understand how behavior works, so we can fight against the manipulators. Catania here talks about mass manipulation. We also call them social engineering these days. Unfortunately, there are people out there who want to manipulate our thoughts, opinions, and behavior. To counter that, I think we all need to learn how our behavior works. Okay, that's enough about politics. The next topic is about the philosophy of language. This topic is rather esoteric and academic in nature, so let's see what they have to say.
Going on to talking about the verbal behavior things, and you mentioned that you hadn't participated in the behavior and brain sciences commentaries. It was just 2 out of those 6 papers were really about verbal behavior at all. And a third one was about ethology, by the way, and Skinner regarded that as a way of reaching out to the ethologists and showing that the things could go both ways. But the 2 things that were about verbal behavior, neither of them had much to do with what had been in the book. One of them was what he unfortunately labeled rule-governed behavior, which I think would be much better verbally governed, which is these kinds of things we talked about with respect to if you shape up what someone else says, you can change behavior that way. And I think it's important for us to understand that. And the other paper was this old one, which was actually, he had published back in the 40s, which is called The Operational Analysis of Psychological Terms. And I'd be curious about the issues were not so much about coming up with some kind of a taxonomy of the kinds of the pieces of verbal behavior, but rather he was interested in how we came to talk about ourselves. And I've always found that argument pretty persuasive, in that we can't share words except on the basis of what we share in public. And therefore, if we want to describe our thinking or our feeling or any kind of private events, the only thing we can go on is the public correlates of those events. So if a parent is interacting with a child and the parent is looking at this red fire truck, or is looking at this dollhouse, and the child is looking at it too, then we can see how they both have the same public determinant there. And so they both can end up with a common vocabulary. But with respect to feelings, nobody can get inside us. And the perennial problem, and actually this problem goes back to Bertrand Russell and before, is how could we ever learn to talk about toothache, since nobody else can feel our toothache, and despite what the politicians say, nobody else can really feel our pain. And I wonder if you've ever it seems to me was
I think there's a
paper
theory. I know that's a very common view. Wittgenstein, Quine, Skinner, others all accepted. I think it's based on a failure to recognize that in the simple case, looking at the fire truck, it's true that the parent and the child share an experience, but the concept in the child's mind goes way beyond the shared experience. The child has a rich knowledge of a complicated notion. What's a truck? What's fire? All of that is prior to the experience, and that gives the meaning that we have. It's true that there's a stimulus which is in common, which triggers the internally structured concept. These are ideas, again, go back to classical Greece. So take Aristotle's example of talks about a house. How do we decide whether something, I'm slightly reinterpreting it. He did it in different terms, but let's put it in modern terms. Suppose you point to that thing over there and you tell the child it's a house. Okay, the child sees what you see, but the concept in its mind goes way beyond what it sees. For example, the child knows without experience that if that thing over there looks like a house, but is used to store books, it's not a house, it's a library. If it's used to store horses, it's a stable, even if it looks exactly like a house. If it was intended to be a school, it's a school, not a house. If you paint the house brown, you're painting its exterior, not its interior, though you can paint it brown on the inside. We can go on and on. Child knows a million things about it, which have nothing to do with the shared experience.
Catania and Chomsky go back to the discussion of the nature of language. This time, it is about knowledge. Philosophers have long been discussing whether knowledge is innate or acquired through experiences. Rationalists and innatists say we are born with knowledge about the world. Chomsky talks about René Descartes as an example. On the other hand, some philosophers believe knowledge comes from experience. This is empiricists. People's mind is a blank slate, and we learn everything about the world through experience. John Locke is one of the most famous empiricists.
And this is true of the simplest words you look at. Suppose you say, tell the child this thing is a book. Well, what does it mean? What does the child know when it says it's a book? You can tell the child this book is the book which you just read is too heavy to pick up. Notice what the child knows. The book is both abstract and concrete. You could pick it up, but you could read it. What you read is abstract. The book is easy to memorize, but hard to pick up. Okay, the child knows that it's both concrete and abstract, and nothing in the world is. All of this rich knowledge is in the background and is all elicited by the common stimulation. So when Wittgenstein, Quine, Skinner, everyone else says, well, all you can know about is the common stimulation, they're just missing everything that happens in the simple words. Well, turning back to toothache, it's the same thing.
It takes a culture to do it. I mean, there's a culture in which there's a word that you mentioned, fire and
there's
fire.
No culture. The child knows nothing about the culture. I'm talking about a 2-year-old child, 3-year-old child, doesn't know the culture, doesn't know any of this stuff. The child is shown a truck, a house, a book, anything. Immediately, this rich structure of conceptual complexity comes into play because of the child's innate nature. That's a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. And we know from experimentation, especially Lilac Lightman and her associates, that a child picks up the meaning of the words from 2 or 3 presentations, almost no evidence. And this very rich structure comes into play, not the culture, not complex concepts like geometrical objects. In fact, it's even true of geometrical objects. Actually, Descartes pointed this out. One of his points is, suppose you take a child in infancy. For him, it was a thought experiment. We can now do the experiments. Take a child in infancy who's never seen a triangle or a geometrical object. Present the child with a drawing of a triangle. What it will perceive is a distorted triangle, not the actual figure that is stimulating its retina, because it interprets geometrical figures in terms of basically Euclidean geometry, which is internal structure. Even the most primitive form of perception involves this. All of this is missed completely by the Wittgenstein, Quine, Skinner approach. And once we get that far, when you turn to complex notions like feelings and toothaches, you get the answer. There's an internal structure which is brought and which is shared and which is elicited by the simplest stimulations. But until we get the simple cases right, we're going to get all the rest of it wrong.
Chomsky and Catania talk about whether we are born with an idea of a triangle. Catania, as a behaviorist, says we need to learn what a triangle is to know it, whereas Chomsky, as a nativist, says we are born with the idea of a triangle as a newborn baby. A triangle is an interesting example because it actually doesn't exist in nature. A perfect triangle only exists in abstract. So how come we have a knowledge of a triangle when it doesn't exist in the nature? From Plato to Chomsky, the answer is that we are born with abstract ideas. But in the mid-20th century, something radical happened in this innatism-empiricism debate, which is called the linguistic term. Philosophers realized one thing. A triangle is not a thing or an abstract concept, but it's a word. That means that a triangle is not an object you can experience in nature, nor an abstract concept that floats in heaven, but it is a set of rules. Now it's getting a little difficult, but follow me here. A triangle is with 3 corners and 3 sides, and that's the definition of a triangle. It's not an object, nor an abstract concept. It is the rules. When we find some objects that fit this rule, we can say this is a triangle. Language is like a game of charades. In charades, we look at a person gesturing something and we try to guess what it is. Let's say a person uses her arm as a nose and do like this, and we call it an elephant. When you think about this game, there's no actual elephant anywhere. We say elephant because the word elephant includes a rule that says it has a long nose. A gesture like this is vague and loose, but enough for us to point to that rule. And that's what knowledge is about. Wittgenstein famously said that language is a game. Skinner and Quine also pointed out the same thing. Language is an ongoing human activity. When we communicate, we are playing a game of charades. Why is this revolutionary? This language as a game points out that knowledge is a gesture game. Quine says words can never describe objects accurately, and this is called linguistic term. In this discussion, Chomsky is not really understanding this point. He's still stuck in the innativism empiricism debate. He argues that we have an innate understanding of a building, a fire truck, a library. He says even a baby has these ideas. I mean, that just doesn't make sense. Babies don't know what a fire truck is or what a library is. Chomsky is getting a little wild here.
There's an internal structure which imposes the concept that the child develops on the basis of limited stimulation. And when you look at particular cases, like the ones I mentioned, you find that the richness of the concept comes almost entirely from the inside. It's barely triggered by bits of stimulation. And when you look at it closely, you can begin to develop the notions, the internal conceptual structure that the child brings to the experience. Starts from the very beginning. Why does the child even know that some of the noises it hears are language related? A chimpanzee has about the same auditory system, just hears noise. The child automatically, reflexively picks out pieces of it as language related, then very quickly turns it into structures that are fit into a basic, restricted, determined phonological framework. No other options are available, and does the same thing in conceptual structure. Now, the error that's made in the cases of the people you mentioned, starting with Wittgenstein, are to focus, to claim that it's the shared stimulus that gives the meaning. No, it doesn't. The shared stimulus, at the very least minimum, barely begins to elicit a rich structure of meaning, which is there altogether. And when you recognize that, you see that there's no different problem really in the case of feelings.
Chomsky doesn't get the linguistic term, and he misunderstands Skinner, Quine, and Wittgenstein. He thinks these three deny the internal perceptual experiences, but they don't deny perceptual phenomena. What they are saying is that language is not good at describing perceptual and subjective experiences. Skinner's point is that we should be careful with words that describe inner experiences, because words can never articulate what they are. When you say pain, what are you actually pointing to? Is it one sensation? Is it multiple sensations? Is it a part of your body? Is it some intensity? The word pain can't articulate it or to communicate it to other people or to use as a scientific subject matter. A subject of scientific study should not be words or concepts, but what's happening in reality, Skinner said. And that's the basis of behaviorism philosophy. Okay, the second meeting ends here. Congratulations again if you are still watching. This one was another long discussion. I'm sure we all exhausted by now. This was definitely a graduate level discussion. It was pretty intense discussion with a lot to unpack. This time I think Chomsky was going a bit too wild here and there, saying things that are questionable. Catania was working hard to keep balance, I think. What do you think of this discussion? Did you find anything interesting? Or do you have any questions? If you do, let me know in the comment section below. If you want to watch more of my tutorials of the third meetings, let me know. I will try to make it someday. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. ありがとうございました。